All right, would like to call to order the regular meeting of the NFP Review Board for April 25th, 2023. Jamie, can we get a roll call?
Yes. Director Colwick. Director Fuller.
Here.
Director Glasser. Director Leto.
Here.
Director Martin.
Here.
Director Sylvester.
Here.
Thank you.
Can I entertain a motion to excuse absent members Colwick and Glasser?
So moved.
Support.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Adoption of the agenda as presented. Are there any additions to the agenda or modifications that board members would like to add or Jamie would like to add?
I move approval of the agenda.
Okay.
Support.
All in favor of the approval of the agenda as presented, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Next, on to the meeting minutes. If folks had a chance to review those, are there any edits, additions, or otherwise to the meeting minutes from February 28th, 2023?
I have a really small correction. In item G1, new business, the second sentence says Mr. Fuller. It should be Mr. Fulling. A little confusing with a Fuller and a Fulling, but that one should be Fulling.
If anyone should notice, it should be you.
I noticed.
Okay, anything else? Great, barring the one edit by Director Fuller, can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes from February 28th, 2023?
So moved.
Support.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Next item on the agenda will be general citizen comments. Don't see any folks joining us tonight, but we should note that we're gonna take all citizen comments, general NFP comments, or individual items at one time, it sounds like. So I don't think there's anyone from the audience that's gonna make a comment tonight, but do we have any on the phone, Nolan?
Hello, caller ending in 0411. This is the NFP board meeting. You have 3 minutes to comment. Are you still with us? No other comments at this time.
Okay, thanks, Nolan. Okay, item F on the agenda, board comments. Are there any general comments from board members regarding NFP matters? I actually had a couple of items that might be better for a future discussion, but I just wanted to bring them up and revisit them as I was looking through the changes from the zoning updates. The first one was on the one-to-one tree replacement. So I remember discussing that it was kind of impractical to replace at a DBH ratio. So for every inch in diameter, the individual would have to put one additional tree on site of that size, and that there's just not physically enough room for that many trees to grow. I remember having a discussion about since we did a tree-to-tree basis, if there was any way we could have that the same idea as the DBH, but that those trees could be planted at another site. And I guess I don't remember if we ever had further discussion on that, whether there's like some kind of bank or fund that developers could put in that the city could plant trees in other locations, or like citizen groups could utilize, so that the sort of spirit of that is there, but this more practical, I guess. So I just, as I was looking through this, I think our standard is good as written, but I was curious as if we ever explored that further.
I'm happy. So item number 3 under G, new business, we're going to talk about any changes to the zoning code, so we can certainly add that one on there. That's not on my list, so I'll add that tree standard to that
Okay.
conversation.
And the other item that I had in mind may fit in this same category too, but become kind of increasingly clear what generally are used in construction sites as far as erosion control materials, and that wildlife entrapment and biodegradation could be issues that would be relevant to the natural features protection areas or even citywide zoning. And I did find the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has some really good recommendations as far as erosion control materials. And I know that a lot of our projects we've looked at have had pretty sizable areas for erosion control. And so, yeah, I wondered maybe that's a good spot for that item too.
Absolutely. So I'll add in erosion control or silt fencing or any of the construction protection fencing. We can put that in there as well.
Okay. Great. Any other board comments? Okay. Item G on the agenda is a new business. So number 1 tonight is the approval of the NFP site plan for a project located at 3915 Stadium Drive. And we have a staff presentation followed by the applicant presentation, I believe.
Mic check, there we go. Hello, my name is Nolan Bergstrom, community planner, going to present the staff report tonight. Just a little background first. So the subject property is an existing car wash located in the community commercial zone district at 3915 Stadium Drive. The applicant will be expanding the pavement around the building to improve driving lanes and expand vacuum services. The project applied for site plan review and is scheduled to go before the Site Plan Review Committee on April 26th. The project consists of expanding asphalt pavement, installing upgraded utility connections for the new vacuum system, adding stormwater retention and treatment, and additional landscaping to meet the Chapter 50 zoning code requirements. The applicant has been working closely with the city stormwater engineer to ensure compliance with all NFP stormwater requirements. The stormwater plan is under review by the engineer. So I'll invite the applicants up to provide any more background on the project right now.
Thank you. My name is Eric Brokus. I'm the owner and president of Rick and Stan's Car Wash. This is weird not having a 3-minute time limit. Interesting. Okay. So we're looking for just a general overview of the project. So this is a site that we acquired a couple of years ago. I've had this vision in my head for this site for a while. We're trying to take the existing location that's been there since, I believe, the 70s, 76, 77. It needs some updating. We're trying to kind of modernize it and bring it up to current times, current standards. You know, we have 7 other locations around Allegan, Otsego, Plainwell, Kalamazoo, and Portage. We're trying to streamline and bring this site up to kind of what we feel is our quality and make it match some of our other sites. So we're looking at adding some vacuum lanes on the west end of it, some free vacuums on the west side, a couple of automated pay stations for the customers to pay for, to implement the unlimited wash pass with. We're taking the existing storage building that's there and keeping it in place for the employees to kind of have like a little break room / lounge. And it'll be kind of redone into a little mini office. sort of thing. Not touching anything with the outside of the building, just redoing some interior, replacing some equipment, and most of the stuff is going to take place on the inside of the building, not touching the outside of the building at all. Most of the stuff that we're doing is really on the outside of it with the paving and extending the parking lot in the back for the cars to loop around, and making a walkway for the employees between their break room and the actual car wash itself. We like to have kind of a little mini walkway path for them that's kind of designated just for this. What we found is that since we are a car wash with vehicle traffic, that we like to have a safe space for our employees to go from point A to point B and walk through, where they're not in fear of possibly getting hit by a vehicle or something like that. So I think that's mostly the gist of it. This tree here that's on the west-hand side is the tree that's in question with the 24-inch diameter. It's a London plane tree. I asked arborists of Kalamazoo, I believe, was who we used to identify it. It's not a protected species, but it is protected because of its size. We have a really good relationship with Harold Ziegler right next to us. They have a fleet account with us. They bring all their vehicles through. Great people. They mentioned when we bought the property that their insurance company every year says something about that tree, and they always tell them, yeah, we agree, but unfortunately we don't own the tree, so there's nothing we can do about it. But they mentioned that every single year they have to trim it over on the left-hand side there because it starts to encroach on their building, and that's a light right there actually. Starts to get into the light and on their building, and they can have some maintenance every year that they would love to see go away with it. The other thing that's kind of coming into play, if you can go one picture over? There you go. Yep. Miss Dig has come out and marked the main feed of our power coming in. It's pretty, you can't tell from that picture, but it's pretty close to that tree actually. I believe it's within 20 to 25 feet. It's well within the root zone. And if you can go one more picture, I kind of show you how this laid out when there's going to be quite a few upgrades that go on the inside of the building, to the point where we're actually going to have to upgrade the power service coming in because we just don't have enough juice to handle it all. So I've been working with Consumers Energy, Kevin Scheel over there specifically. Circled in red is the transformer that's feeding our building right now. We initially thought that it was probably getting fed from that power line that's to the right of it in front of Gage. We were kind of like, hey, that probably makes sense. It's a straight shot to the transformer, easy. But unfortunately, it's actually being fed from a different power line that's to the south of Harold Ziegler there. That red is the entire pathway of where our main power comes from the power pole. So it actually cuts across, stops about 25-ish feet short of that tree, shoots over our parking lot, and then shoots over to that transformer. And from talking to consumers, at first there was some concern that the wires underground weren't going to be large enough for the new service transformer. They were gonna have to pull bigger wire. He told me that it's really borderline for what they like to see. They could probably get by, but unfortunately, whether it's too big or too small, it was put in so long ago that they ran aluminum wire from that power pole, which they don't allow anymore. That's not code anymore. It has to be copper wire, which is something I didn't know myself. But he said, so regardless of whether it was going to be big enough or not, they're going to replace it because they need to have copper wire. So there's going to be for them to do their job anyway, they're already going to be doing some boring and probably some saw cutting as well within that root zone. And they were kind of happy about the tree going away too, so it made their job a little easier. So I guess kind of for these two reasons, we're kind of thinking it might be best if the tree gets replaced with a couple of other Michigan native trees somewhere else on the property. Any other questions? Yes, no, maybe?
So summarizing, the applicant's design team evaluated the site to identify all protected natural features on the property. The site was placed in the NFP overlay district due to a small area of protected slopes with woodlands in the southeast corner of the parcel. There is one protected tree with a DBH of 24 inches, the London plane tree. Staff discussed the potential of leaving the tree in place due to its size. However, the applicant explained that the tree's proximity to a building on an adjacent property creates a threat, and a utility upgrade required by consumers' energy will disturb the root zone of the tree. With documentation, these reasons meet the tree removal criteria in the ordinance. The applicant also changed earlier site plan drawings, which placed the stormwater retention area within the protected slopes in the southeast corner. The applicant was able to redesign the placement of the retention ponds outside of the slope protected area, further to the north on the parcel. So since the project is located within the NFP overlay district, the site requires the following NFP site development standards. The tree protection standard. Project meets the tree removal requirement. Applicant will replant a sugar maple to replace the London plane tree. The woodland protection standard. The project does not plan to disturb or remove any of the existing woodland tree cover on the site, although the construction fencing will be required. Slope protection standard. The project does not plan to disturb or regrade protected slopes on the site. Applicant has proposed removing some debris if necessary to restore that area. The plants selection. Within NFP overlay district, projects must select native species for all landscaping requirements. This plan includes a landscaping plan with some native and non-native species. These plantings can include a variety of native cultivars approved by the board. And stormwater management. Channel protected standard and water quality treatment are increased in NFP. The low impact development method as described in section 50-6.2. These elements are under review for approval by the city's stormwater engineer. After staff review, the plan appears to meet NFP standards and qualifies for conditional approval based upon the following. All landscaping species required under the zoning code shall be Michigan native species, and documentation is provided to demonstrate tree removal meets the minimum criteria, threat to an existing building or infrastructure. Staff recommends approval after the NFB Board of Directors has reviewed and confirmed the planting species on the landscaping planting schedule in the provided packet. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolan. Okay, board discussion.
I think I have much to add. I think it's a good example of how NFB and business investment can work together, and how NFB can support development. This is being accommodated.
Yeah, I agree. I think I appreciate the applicant's effort to stay within the existing footprint and avoid that woodland in the southeast corner. I think that shows that the intent is there to honor the NFP. And I think that being that it's a non-native tree and it's potentially a future hazard tree and in the utility right away, it seems justifiable to remove it in this case, especially considering the protection of the existing woodland with likely more native species in the southeast corner. I also saw there was a 9-inch, probably a Bradford pear being proposed to be removed, and I definitely appreciate that because they're getting to be a real nuisance, naturalizing and kind of becoming invasive. So I would suggest, I don't see the placement for the future tree, but just given looking at your photo there to the north, it seems like it might be a good area to plant it in the median so that, you know, in 30 years don't run into the same issue with tree becoming too big and getting close to buildings. It could provide some shade to the adjacent parking lot that would create some added function. So that's my general thoughts. The other item that I think that Nolan presented, that would be this would be contingent on using native species and looking at the planting schedule. None of those species would qualify as written there. So I think pending that that modification, that would fit. I think some of your fountain grass, for example, you could use native switchgrass, which is the tall, warm season grass, native to prairies. Some of your shrubs, you could use red osier dogwood, shrubby cinquefoil, spice bush. There's lots of other options out there. We do have a list of suggested species in the NFP, right? So we have our protected species list. I can pull that up, see if.
The list that's in there is more riparian, so it's going to be things that like water a little bit more than maybe in this space. I can send some resources, though, that can help you select those plants if you need that.
Yeah. Great. Any other comments or discussion from board members?
I guess a question I should have asked earlier, do you know where the replanting will be of the sugar maple, or is that up in the air a little bit?
It's on the landscape plan, and there's one required near the front, one required in the front, and then the other one, just to give it enough space, is kind of the southwest corner.
Okay, great. Sorry, I missed that.
Great. Okay, anything else from board members? Okay, could we entertain a motion to approve the NFP site plan for the project at 3915 Stadium Drive, pending some landscaping native plant updates?
So moved.
Support.
You want to do a voice vote for this one, Jamie?
Yeah, I can do a roll call vote. Director Fuller.
Aye.
Director Leto.
Aye.
Director Martin.
Aye.
Director Sylvester.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Motion passes. Okay, item number 2 in new business is approval of a recommendation to the City Commission for the appointment of Laura Fredrickson to the NFP Review Board.
Yeah, before we go on to that, I just want to say thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. And I know you have your full site plan tomorrow, so I'll make sure we get all of this information in a letter to you guys, and that'll be one of the boxes checked off for that approval. You're welcome to stay if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Chair Leto, yes, thank you. In your agenda packets, you're going to see the board application for Laura Fredrickson. Chair Colwick and Director Fuller held some interviews with 2 applicants. There were originally 4 applicants for the board vacancy that's up for approval right now. The 2 board members reviewed all 4 of those applications and thought that 2 of them seemed highly qualified for this vacancy. Both were landscape architects from local firms. And after meeting those individuals and asking them a couple of questions through that interview process, Director Fuller and Director Colwick both had agreed that Laura Fredrickson really would add a lot of value to the board. She has a strong background in landscape architecture and works for Whiteman and Associates here in Kalamazoo, and just had a really strong interest in improving the environment and the built environment together, and also had a lot of experience with park design, so sort of working in that kind of urban but open green space, and seemed to really embrace and understand kind of the purpose and intent of NFP. I'll let Director Fuller add any comments if you want, since you were able to meet the individuals.
I actually missed her meeting, so I can't add anything in particular, but I just based on her resume, I think she'll bring a lot. I think having somebody with that landscape architecture background will be really helpful for those of us who don't have that experience.
And so I'll just go talk a little bit about the process here. So upon the recommendation of this board, the staff will take this information and put it into a memo to the mayor and city commission, and then they have the ability at the next commission meeting to appoint Laura as a director, and then Laura would be able to join us at a future meeting.
Any other board discussion? Okay. Entertain a motion to approve a recommendation to the city commission for the appointment of Laura Fredrickson to the NFP Review Board.
So moved.
Support.
Okay. All in favor? Or,
Aye.
sorry, would you like to do a roll call?
I think you can do a voice vote like this, that's fine.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Hearing none, motion to appoint Ms. Fredrickson passes. Great. Item 3 in new business is the review of NFP standards in Chapter 50-6.2 in the city zoning code and potential amendments.
Yeah, so I've prepared very, very minimal slides, but just to kind of walk us through the changes that are within the proposed updates to Chapter 50 overall. I'm going to give you some background and kind of where city staff is going with this rezoning. And then I'd love this board to take some time to talk about changes that you might recommend, or language within the code that could be improved upon that would really help with the interpretation and really the application of the code. And I think especially it's been some of those variance requests that have been a little bit tricky to look at that criteria and decide, does in fact this project or this request for relief meet the minimum criteria? So Beth, if you would advance to the next slide. I also just want to, I'm passing out a press release that just came out from the city, and it has to do with some specific parcels in the rezoning. It didn't plan on talking about those today, but you can see there is an update, and so I'll let you guys take a look at that. And then again, just for anyone who's watching the live stream today, if you go to imaginekalamazoo.com, you should be able to find all of the resources that you need to check out what the city is proposing. So I want to start a little bit with backing up here, high level purpose and limits of rezoning, because I have seen, and I shared with you all some of the recommendations, the questions, the concerns that are coming out about different parts of the zoning code, but certainly the NFP section of the code, which is 6.2 in Chapter 50. And we do certainly have some guardrails, if you will, some limitations within the law. And so the Chapter 50 is the city's zoning code, and it is really, it's an authority granted by the Zoning Enabling Act in Michigan, and it lets cities create zoning codes, it lets them create zone districts, and that's all about cities having the ability to control how the land is used and develop standards around how it is developed. And so that's kind of again, those guardrails that we're working within. So within that, it's really guiding how a property is developed and not necessarily what it's developed into as far as NFP, right? I think the applicant today is a great example, right? We can ask a project to stay within some standards, to consider the natural features that are there, but likely not be able to protect each and every one. It's gonna have to be balanced with the development that they're proposing to do. But the bigger picture here is the city, as you're probably familiar, adopted a new master plan in 2017, and in that master plan is, required by law, a future land use map. And it's kind of bubbly, and it's a variety of different land use types, and it's supposed to sort of be a vision for what the zoning code and the actual zone districts will look like, right? So it's big picture. We have parks in this area, we have a dense downtown in this area, and then the idea is that has some public input behind it, and that the zoning code should follow it. It's a vision from the community. Our current planning and zoning staff, our planning division, has been taking that master plan for a number of years now, I would say 4 or 5 years now, and going through these large rezoning projects and starting to match up the zoning code. And this is where a lot of communities don't always go to this big of an overhaul. But we've said, hey, there's best practice in zoning now. We're going to a much more form-based code, which is best practice now. Our city planner has looked at all of these different zones and said, hey, do we need new or different zones? And you see this in this commercial zoning. We went from that community commercial that you guys hear of often, and it's kind of split now into a community commercial and a CC1 and a CC2. So you can kind of step back some of that intensity within those different districts. And so I just, again, want to direct folks to some of the public Q&A sessions that are happening. There's the last one scheduled for this Thursday, so if you want to really dig into the whole map, that's around 2,000 parcels that are being rezoned or kind of fit into this new commercial zoning, I would encourage folks to do that. There's all sorts of parts of Chapter 50 that are being modified in certain ways, so certainly those will be covered in that Q&A session. Our city planner is also having these availability sessions, so if you want to schedule some one-on-one time with her, you can. She has a meeting schedule that you can just get signed up in different slots and talk to her about, especially if you're a specific property owner who wants to talk about your property, that's the time to have that, one-on-one meeting. But certainly if you have any, in your NFP capacity and in your professional capacity, if you have recommendations for the city, certainly get those to me and Christina, and she is looking for input. I wanted to mention that I was looking back at our agendas, it was about 1 year ago we started talking about this is coming and we should look at the landscape section that covers all of the city and not just NFP. And we've had a lot of feedback since that time. I know this board, a couple folks weighed in. We've decided to use a landscape architect firm who's gonna look at our code, give us some recommendations from other cities that they've worked with. One of the things we asked for was we'd really like to consider that prohibited plant list that's just in NFP right now and applying that across the city. It's a fairly short list of sort of the worst offenders, and we should be discouraging and prohibiting those citywide. So those are some of the changes I think we'll see, but once we get that draft back, I'll give you guys an opportunity to kind of react to that one as well. But today I just wanted to think about and look at NFP, and then again, we have a couple of months here, but now is really the time if there are some major changes that you think, major, minor, any scale changes that you think are going to help make the code better, that we should think about making those changes now. So, yep, NFP is part of the city zoning code, so we're restricted to those zoning standards. That's just one of the limitations of how we set this all up from the beginning. And again, we're looking for opportunities to improve how the code is applied to these individual projects. Back, we go forward one. Okay. So I broke down here what I think are kind of the different categories of changes that you'll see in the code, and I gave you the section. You'll see it's redlined, just the 6.2 NFP section, so if you want to follow along. But I know for a while now we have in the code these criteria. There's 3 criteria for granting variances. And I feel like this board has really kind of gone back and forth when you're evaluating a project, how do these criteria help help you determine if a project or a request for relief is valid or not, and if it's something you want to request up to, make a recommendation up to the ZBA. We as staff discussed that. We went back and forth, is there any sort of change to the criteria? And in the end, we felt like maybe it was the intent that needed to be more clear because that's used as one of the criteria. So I'm going to get into that in just a second, but that's an area where I'd really like all of your input into how do you think all of that wording could be tightened up so that it's easier to determine, yes, we feel comfortable granting or recommending relief, or no, we'd like to be able to feel very comfortable in voting no if you feel like a request doesn't meet the criteria. So I guess it's just making sure the criteria are as clear as they can be. They certainly use a lot of words like reasonable and, some of that language that is going to take a board of human beings to interpret and, put a little bit of judgment on that. There's a lot coverage section, and I'll take a minute to talk about this. I think I have it right here, but the lot coverage section, I had gone ahead and asked the city planner that we consider removing this. So what I really want to point out is that lot coverage requirements is an underlying zoning requirement within each district. So in the M1 and M2, which are manufacturing districts, there's a limit on the amount of impervious surface you can have on that lot. I don't have that in front of me, but let's say it's somewhere around 70-ish%. Can be impervious, the rest, or can be impervious, the rest is pervious, right? That is a coverage for all sorts of uses. It goes down to 60% and less, right, where you can't have as much impervious cover. What the NFP layer or overlay district layered onto that was that the way the code is written right now, an applicant, when they're doing a redevelopment project or development project, can't disturb any of the area that's going to remain pervious, right? And that one doesn't tie very tight or very closely to protecting a natural feature. In the city, most pervious areas are mowed turf grass, right? And that's not necessarily good, bad, or otherwise. It's just not a very solid natural feature. And then I think in a lot that might have some woodland cover and some lawn, if you think about it strictly, if you had to follow that criteria or that standard, you have an allowance to remove woodland. It might be easier to remove the woodland and leave the lawn because you want the lawn there in the future. So it just doesn't really, it's never lend itself to really protecting any natural features. And if anything, it feels like it's just one more factor that needs to be, worked around or worked in where it almost detracts from protecting natural features. Like I think we've really nailed down those main features that should be looked at or can be looked at and can be protected whenever possible. And so the lot coverage section, I was asked by our staff, is there any of it that we just want to modify? Do we want to keep any of it in there? And from, my review, I don't know if any of it is super valuable. And again, I don't know if it's really tied back to protecting anything natural. We can't say what that pervious surface is now. So I'm going to recommend that we remove it, but again, open to discussion on that item if we want to talk about that one. There was, in this last year, I believe, wellhead protection was an overlay district, just like NFP. It is controlled by some other laws in the state of Michigan, and so it's been pulled out and created, it's been made into its own ordinance. It's really been updated, again, to meet kind of standard practice for wellhead protection and source water protection in Michigan. And so the way the code is written, and I will even say how it's redlined in here, I want to take a closer look at it because they just don't speak to each other anymore. There used to be this whole list of land uses that wouldn't fit into like the 1 year or the 5 year wellhead zones. And they kind of got away from that, and so they just don't speak to each other very well anymore. And so I'm going to take a look at that with staff and likely change that up, and we can talk about that one next month. And then MNFI, we have a section at the end here. It's not redlined at all in this version, but Director Colwick had brought up an idea that she shared with staff, and she would like us to consider how we might update the language. And I was going to paraphrase some of the information that she was passing along, which was very technical. And she recommended I work with Becca Rogers in their office to think about, essentially, I think what she'd like to see us do is get a little more sophisticated in what records we use to evaluate against on a project. And mostly she's saying that some of these records, they have like a locational certainty to them or uncertainty to them, and we should kind of use that in some way to say, if it's really high certainty in location, then that should matter a lot more, and if it's really locationally uncertain, that maybe those are the ones that we drop off. We used to look at it in age, right? Oh, if we saw it, if it was found in the last 20 years, that's more relevant, and if it wasn't found in a long time, that's less relevant. And she's saying that's probably not the best way to go about it. It's more about locational certainty. So I'm going to let her speak to that, and she did send me some information on that, but I'd like to take a look at the code, and if it makes sense to make some changes just to make that really clear. I think it makes it easier for all of you when you're evaluating applications. Okay. Beth, will you go to the next one, please? Thank you. So if you look at page 108 in the handout I gave you, I just want to talk about and try to get your feedback and get you thinking about any changes, if we think they're necessary, for the zoning relief criteria and the intent. And I think that maybe the language in the intent section, we'll talk about that one in a second. I think there's maybe it's just not very descriptive, and maybe there's some changes we want to do there. But the criteria itself, I have it kind of summarized here on the screen, but there's really 3 criteria. That a parcel cannot be reasonably utilized for its zone purpose without this variance, that they're requesting the minimum needed, they're not just going crazy, it is a minimum, and that the relief can be granted, what the code says right now is without detriment to the public good and will not impair the intent of the NFP overlay district. When we talked with city attorneys and staff, we feel like that without detriment to the public good has been hard to evaluate. It's very subjective. Public good is this very big concept and can be very broad. And really, you're stuck with the zoning code, which says you can control the use a bit as long as it meets zoning, and you can make sure that folks are following standards. But that public good was going to get us into some subjective, weird areas that you might be making calls that you would or wouldn't feel confident about. And so we thought if we removed that part, maybe we really need to lean into it's not impairing the intent of the NFP overlay district. And I think as staff, when we look at these projects, we often get multiple iterations, right? Usually the first site plan we get in, we take a look at it, and you get a pretty good sense if they have inventoried and worked around the natural features at all. And a lot of times in that first go-round, there really hasn't been design that's thoughtful to the natural features. And I think where NFP has really helped guide in a successful way these site plans is that then we get the second version, and then we pick at that a little more, and then we get the third, and then we get a version like we saw today where the stormwater pond was moved entirely out of. Before they thought, oh, we can just tear down, we'll utilize and use the back part of the property. We'll just regrade it, pretty easy, take down the trees, we'll put the stormwater back there. And NFP was able to successfully, require that engineering staff take a look holistically at the site, really take a good inventory of what's there. They even had an arborist come out just for their 2 trees, right? But they got a little bit of information. They talked with their neighbors. They figured out like what's best to do, considering everything, considering the public good in some way, right? And so that's what I think we're trying to get to in the language. And so I guess that's where I wanted you guys to talk about whether you feel like these criteria have, serve this board and serve the applicants well when you're considering relief, or if you think the intent in some of that stuff needs to be edited or changed in any way. And Beth, will you advance one again, please? Yeah, thank you. And so here's the intent, and you can see this section, it's on the first page, page 88. So you can see in red where we thought this intent section didn't say much when we first wrote it, which was interesting because I think we talked a whole lot about intent, a whole lot when we were working with the ad hoc committee that put together the original recommendation. And we wanted to say something a bit about balance, right? Because when you're determining if something is, if relief is, impairing the intent of NFP, I think the idea is, at least from my perspective, the idea is, did they go through that exercise where they inventoried and took into account all of the natural features, how far they could set back, how they could move things around, how they could design kind of in and around those natural features as much as possible. And so, maybe balance isn't the right word, and maybe support development while protecting natural features. If those things seem too much at odds, we could kind of change that to say what you feel like it needs to say, to be able to make that distinction. Where do you want to be able to draw that line to say, this really isn't meeting the intent of NFP anymore? I think you've really just gone beyond and kind of disregarded natural features too much. And so we don't feel comfortable recommending a variance. So I'm going to stop talking and let you guys think about this and make any comments you want. My last slide is about timing. So if you guys feel like we want some more time to really think about this and look at this document, I think we have a couple of months to be able to bring this back to the board and continue discussion.
A question about the process. So what are you asking of this board?
So I guess I'll step up to the schedule and fit the process into schedule. So we've been doing, Planning Division's been doing these informational sessions this month. May 4, our city planner is going to go to Planning Commission. She started this in April. She's going to do it this month. I think she even has it planned on the calendar in June. She's going like section through section and just talking through each and every change and the rationale with the Planning Commission. They really want to get into this deeply before they make any kind of recommendation. We think by late May, we'll be releasing like the next revised draft. You just saw the press release go around that's saying that we're already changing the map. So hopefully you saw that the two parcels are going to be just removed at this time and considered separately, if and when that's necessary. And so what I'd like to know is if sort of the red sections in the changes that are being recommended right now in the NFP 6.2 section, if those feel like the right direction for you guys as a board member, for future board members. I'm opening it up to if there's other sections that I think that and we can spend a couple minutes talking about the tree stuff and fencing, right? This is maybe the time to think about those things. Are there ways NFP can put in some standards that are protective that it just doesn't right now? So I'm just looking for kind of your feedback and then hoping to work that into whatever comes out as our like sort of final release of the text. And we expect that would be midsummer would probably be the earliest, mid to late summer. That would go to Plan Commission for a recommendation and City Commission for approval.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Jamie, for all the background and context. That's really helpful. I think my first comment is about that intent language. I know I've been getting some comments from folks that are really concerned about that word support. And I'm not sure how much that adds to the intent. I think the second sentence, or pardon me, the last, I guess that is the second and last sentence of that intent section really does add some clarifying language. But I'm not sure that adding the word support in the first sentence is as helpful. And will be controversial from my understanding. So I think either we could leave it as is, or we could change the word support to guide, perhaps, although we do say guide again in that second sentence, so that might be a little redundant. So I think, like I said, I think that second sentence does a nice job of adding some meat to the intent and some good context, but I'd like to see that word support changed or removed.
Okay.
If I can that's a good comment, I agree, and I'd like to kind of riff off of that. I think that there's kind of two thoughts here. One is that I think the way that it's worded with support while protecting natural features makes it seem as if development is the primary intent and natural features is sort of a secondary intent. But in my mind, that's the whole reason that this mechanism exists, to protect the natural features. And I could see that, especially with the relief criteria, which I was going to ask where that physically sits in the standards. But with the relief criteria mentioning, you had it up on the previous slide, something about as long as, relief may be granted as long as it doesn't conflict with the intent of NFP. And if the intent of NFP is to support development and the variances are being requested to support, it feels to me like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like,
Sure.
Of course it's not conflicting with promoting development, because that's what folks are asking for. They're asking for variances for, more space or, more relief, I guess. So I could see where that could get us into a pickle in that way. I do like the second sentence, the word balance, because I think that puts things on an equal plane. When you think of a balance, like they're two things that are up there with sort of equal representation. I guess the way that NFP feels to me is it's a zoning district, but it feels more like a regulation, and it doesn't seem like it's not there to accelerate or facilitate development. It seems like the base zoning districts in the master plan are really what guide those, and then NFP is there to be a check on that process. And so I could see kind of a hybridization of that, and I do appreciate this because I think that we get a lot of calls from folks who think that NFP makes these designated conservation areas and that they can't be developed. And as nice as that might be in some instances, I think it just creates kind of a false impression for folks, and can, result in some conversations where we can't really help out in that way. But
Thank you. And given my orientation, I actually felt positive when I read that language change, but I predicted that there might be some uneasiness with it, and that folks might like something that's more value neutral, some terminology that's a little less value loaded. And I think I like the suggestion of guide, if that feels like a less certain word. And yet I thought that the use of the word support, support means different things to different people, and I think some people will read that to mean that it would advocate for it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that. As we know, in the various uses of the English language, support can mean different things. It can mean that it can coexist with it. So I would support the use of the word guide or a similar word, some synonym to it, because I think this clarification of intent, just as you said, Mitch, I think that really is helpful to the city and to the public.
yeah, and I before you had presented the relief criteria, I was wondering what mechanical function intent plays. We always go to what's the tree standard, what's the woodland standard, but that was very helpful reviewing the relief portion, and that refers to the intent, and I think that helps contextualize why this language is important and worth wordsmithing over, I guess.
Yeah, I believe that this is the only reference to intent, and But it does play this very critical role that board members will always be looking to it and looking to that section to make that, judgment call for a recommendation. So it sounds like we might be in a good spot with intent if we especially look at that first sentence and either leave it as is or maybe choose a different word than support. I could see it just leaving it as is, but that second sentence then sets that expectation that we're looking for. I still wonder, and it's not a decision that we have to make this evening, but I still wonder if those criteria, those three criteria are useful, if there's anything that seems a bit vague about those criteria that you want to take a look at. Again, I feel like maybe this idea of an applicant having to prove or demonstrate that they took every step they could to avoid impact. I think that often becomes part of the conversation when you guys have these hearings. You'll be asking those kinds of questions. So what did you do to try to minimize the impact? Is this the least amount of request? And I think even there's been demonstrated precedents in the past where maybe an applicant comes forward, shows this board a plan, didn't maybe get a warm reception, so they come back and they come and ask for less. So it's always that balance of are they asking for that minimum relief needed? And maybe that second criterion already hits it. And I have also talked to the attorney's office about, they didn't recommend, but they certainly were willing to help us if we wanted to develop any kind of like guidance policy or just a guidance for this board, maybe using some of your past experience. Not that it sets a hard precedence for you all, but that would guide you and future board members in kind of how do you use especially I think it's the relief criteria. How has it been interpreted? How do you want to apply it? Just giving you maybe some examples in some sort of policy guidance that would be a companion.
I do have a comment about that, and it will turn into a question of you, is when we make decisions here, they are referred then to the Zoning Board of Appeals. And the Zoning Board of Appeals makes decisions that really have, some effect. And those are, as we know, quasi-judicial kind of decisions that they make. And they follow criteria, and they should follow that criteria very carefully about when they do and when they don't grant relief. And so it seems like these relief standards should become important to them, and they should be aware of those as they are with their criteria that they should follow scripturally for use and non-use variances. There are these statutory relief standards, and it would seem ideal that also they would be knowledgeable of that and would follow that. Does that make sense to you, and does that seem like a logical outcome?
Yeah, we as staff have talked about that, where the standards for NFP relief are different. There's these three criteria, and for the ZBA, they follow state criteria that govern all types of zoning relief requests. So they're a little bit different, but it's kind of great. I think it's a good system where a project's almost kind of going through to filters, if you will, right? First, you all are looking at it just from a very natural features perspective, but then the ZBA gets to also put the lens of landowner rights and making sure the city isn't taking away too much of that the request is, fair to anyone who comes before the board and kind of meets these. There's more criteria. I feel like there's 5 or 6 of them that are within state law. I've had a lot of questions, and I still think there's probably some more education and explanation that staff can give to the ZBA, because this is just, one small piece of what they do, and so I think we could be able to spend some more time explaining these criteria to them as well. But I'll go to the ZBA meeting and kind of give this explanation of what the board's reaction and ultimate determination was based on these 3 criteria. If that answers your question.
I was just gonna ask for maybe a clarification or expansion. I think it's it's a tricky conversation because this is basically like a bulleted description of the gray area, and we're basically called in to assist with perspectives where it's gray and where it doesn't clearly meet NFP. So I appreciate that it's tricky to see. With the detriment to public good, I guess that, you know, the reasonable use, and the word reasonable in there, you know, feels as gray as the public good piece, to me, and it sounds like maybe there's some legal implications for public good that, we don't fully understand, but for example, the Kalamazoo Country Club project, it was asking for relief so it could be reasonably used for that purpose, which is a golf course. See, none of us are golf course experts, and so maybe that ultimately is something for the zoning board of appeals, since they know what's a reasonable use for that type of zoning. But I guess I find that very subjective as well. But I also understand that that's our role here. So I guess, yeah, I'm wondering if why the public good piece is such a distinctly
Yeah.
problematic.
I can speak to that a little bit. I think you're right. I think reasonable is extremely subjective. However, it's kind of tied to that use. And so it's reasonable use, that you're not completely taking away the reasonable use of a project. And zoning controls use. It can very clearly, you have, like, a municipality has the ability to control use through the zoning code. The public good is a little bit harder. I don't think public good necessarily is protected, and that the law allows under the zoning code, a municipality to kind of make that decision or grant relief based on something like public good. And I think the issue here has been, you know, do trees take away shading on an adjacent property? Maybe that's more of a personal good than a public good. So that one you might be able to say, okay, I don't know if it's taking away all of the public good, but we have heard folks come forward and say, this project taking away trees is going to impact, you know, harm the public good in air quality or in stormwater or in climate change impacts. And that could be very true. And a board member could look at this and say, wow, I really can't comfortably say that there won't be any detriment to the public good. That becomes problematic because I don't think we can use the zoning code to justify as a law that we're protecting climate for everyone. I wish we could, but I think that, you know, that's just a legal limitation, that it's a reality we have to work within. And so that feels like it puts board members in it could put you in a position where you don't feel okay passing an ordinance, a request for a variance where everything else feels like you'd be in pretty, you know, solid ground to say, yes, I recommend something to go forward. So that's kind of where it's not tied to maybe as strong of zoning regulations.
And terminology like permit, reasonable use seems familiar to zoning ordinances and how they're written. It talks about things like reasonably use the real estate without the granted relief and things. So it's not alien language in zoning. I don't know about public good. That seems like a political concept more than a zoning concept. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess if the public good is removed, then I think it puts just renewed emphasis on that intent piece. And so I think that, yeah, all of a sudden becomes much more important to, yeah, get the language on that correct. Let's see.
Well, Mitch is thinking, I'll just ask a little bit more about the lot coverage. I wonder if there might be bits of that might be worth retaining, and I need to think about it a little more carefully, but I was wondering if maybe at our next meeting, could we look at some hypotheticals, some pictures?
Yeah.
Like, if this was here and this was here and this was called pervious and this was impervious, how these would impact? Because I'm just wondering if, you know, if our natural features are things like slopes and woodlands, and if it does make sense to keep pervious next to some of our natural features. I don't have a real strong opinion on this. I'm not totally opposed to just striking it. I want to give it a little bit more thought and maybe looking at some examples, maybe even of past projects. I was trying to think of projects where we've wrestled with that, and I couldn't come up with any, but maybe you can help me remember some.
No, I was going to ask you if, without relitigating anything, but were there any applications we've heard in the past where you wish that there had been different language or more clarity of how to apply the overlay to the application we heard? Weren't there issues that you struggled with involving woodland percentages and how they were able to be re-engineered or reapplied?
With regard to the lot coverage piece, or?
Yeah.
I guess I'm not, so it sounds like the lot coverage is connected to this pervious surface issue where it can't exceed a certain amount, and that's in a different part.
And I was
of
thinking
the-
more of woodland percentages and how those could get reconfigured.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just know that I recall you struggling with one application.
I think one, well, I think,
And it involved the country club application.
yeah. I think one of the initial questions was just to prevent it from, if it's redeveloped, that reduction of woodland is captured so that the new acreage isn't used as the baseline, but they know that there's a certain percentage that's already been removed. I think that was one issue initially, but that felt comfortable that would be memorialized over time. Yeah, I think
Not to put you on the spot.
No,
just
no.
Curious if you had recalled any application where you wished that the language was different than it is.
Yeah, it seemed like it came back to that reasonable use piece because the size of the parcel was very big, and so it seemed like there's more space for being flexible and having space to work around and avoid some of the natural features than there would be on perhaps any other parcel. So I think that's where I struggled. Like the size of the parcel was so big that it felt like there should be lots of room for flexibility.
Yes.
But
And that's where I think that it's nice that it's set up for a 7-member board, so reasonable, the definition of reasonable gets kind of averaged out, right? You need at least the majority of the people on the board to feel that your request is reasonable. And so there can be individuals who maybe lean more toward a different
one way or another.
definition of that reasonableness. I was just going to go back to your comment about leaving in some of those requirements on where to try to leave the pervious coverage. I had some staff make that same exact comment about that same exact standard. And so we might want to look on that, because I think also if we could pull out maybe the most useful that have a natural features benefit, then it actually would be way easier to apply to. Because I feel like right now it just makes it, one more piece of the puzzle that we're trying to fit in, especially on a tight site. They're going to have to disturb most of that. I think that's really where this becomes problematic. You're building a new building, you've got to do some excavation. I mean, that footprint of what the construction site looks like is bigger than what's going to be left pervious in the end. But you're not allowed to disturb any of that here. But it might make perfect sense that, yeah, if you're going to tear it up a little because it just had lawn, you're going to tear it up a little, you're going to regrade, move some things around, you're going to replant it to lawn. That location of that lawn might make sense because it might serve as a buffer or something to something like a woodland or something that's protected on the site. So there could be really some value that I think is closely tied to a natural feature benefit that we might want to consider leaving that one in. So I like that idea of looking at that one a little closer. Do we want to talk about trees? I can revisit and give you a little bit of background on how the tree standard has changed over time.
Sure.
And then let's talk about the erosion control stuff, which I think, just trying to look, we have, We lean a lot on the silt fencing requirements that are actually, again, a different state law that is sedimentation and erosion control permitting during construction. But I think maybe what some of you, I'm just guessing because I've heard some of these U.S. Fish and Wildlife recommendations, that this is some of that erosion control, like blankets or mats that are kept in place after construction to facilitate the revegetation over time. To the tree comment, you're absolutely right about the idea that it seemed impractical and probably not like the best practice to just replace every inch of tree with another inch of tree the way the standard was originally written. And I think the example from today is a perfect one. It's a tight lot. We've got a lot of these in Kalamazoo, and it's a 24-inch tree. And I think this really became evident, if you remember when we were going through NFP Phase 2, updating that map. The first time it didn't pass, so we formed some subcommittees, and we did like this exhaustive deep dive into like every part of the standard. And it became clear that we didn't necessarily want to say you have to plant this, I don't know if it was a 2-inch caliper or even maybe a 4-inch. It was this bigger tree. And I think the board and some of the experts said those aren't always the most successful trees. And so we want to let someone get down to maybe even like a 1-inch DBH. To remove the tree today that we saw on the application, if you allow them to use that bare root 1-inch, they would have to plant 24 trees on that site. And that is not going to be sustainable, and they're not going to keep and probably take care of that tree, and in the end, they're going to be kind of overgrown, and they're going to shade each other out, and you're not going to have 24 great giant trees that grow up. And so the idea was if they did 1-to-1, and then we, through our site inspection process, and we usually have this window for a couple of years, and really in perpetuity, if you have an approved site plan, you've got to keep that vegetation there. We're giving probably that tree the best chance and letting property owners, manage to the best that they can. And so that's where that update was made. That was August of 2021 when City Commission adopted the brand new map that was really expanded, and then quite a bit of changes in the language. So that's where the tree stuff comes in. I would like to talk about the erosion control stuff that you were talking about that maybe we can fit in. There's a whole section K on development standards. So this isn't related to any, it was a section we added at the end. It wasn't, directly related to a natural feature. It was this idea that there were all these sorts of construction and post-construction practices that are best practice for the environment. And so I think maybe somewhere in there it would make sense. It's section J now, site development standards. And we have, in one of these we have construction protection fencing or exclusion fencing, and I think we could fit in erosion control there if we wanted to talk about it.
And I'd be, the way that you said that, some of the landscaping standards might make sense from a zoning perspective to be adopted citywide rather than be addressed in here. I'd be curious to, hear from city staff who review a lot of these projects and know how big of an ask that would be for a citywide zoning change or changing that detail, or maybe it's just appropriate for the NFP. But yeah, it's just going to become increasingly clear. Been a couple of recent development projects around new sidewalks and things like that, and the really fine plastic, and I think some of it is sort of allegedly biodegradable, but it is there for a long time. And even if it was biodegradable, the mesh size makes it really problematic for snakes and rodents and animals getting caught in it. And then it just, also there's like microplastics issues and things like that. And I'm guessing for if someone is seeding lawn, those heavy coconut fiber blankets are not going to work. But as far as what I've seen, there's other options out there, including hydro seeding and things like that can mesh to the site. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had some really good language about, says wildlife safe loose sweep design with movable non-welded joints, allowing twines to move independently and thus reducing the potential for wildlife entanglement. And then some requirements about fitting securely to the ground. So it seems like, pretty much every project that's not using the exact same footprint is going to have some type of erosion control. And so it just sort of struck me the more I thought about it, how many times that's probably used and, within NFP, but all the time.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that same standard applied when U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or any federal dollars have been used. In Kalamazoo in particular, so a lot of the stream restoration, a lot of the PCB remediation, a lot of that's riparian work, and same thing, like when I've walked out to some of those sites with the city, some of the federal staff have said, so you can see this, it's a, woven material, but it's something as simple as the lines aren't welded together, so if you're a larger animal, you can easily kind of move those to poke through, but otherwise it's a complete barrier to anything smaller if it is that sort of welded in place, and you've got to fit into a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch grid. You got to be able to fit through that, or you're not going to be able to fit. We could try to work that into the code. I think it would make good sense if maybe staff, we could talk to a few of like engineers and contractors on these sites, because the only thing I'd like to understand is where do we make sure that those specs are being seen and the purchasing is happening and then the right stuff is getting put down.
Yeah.
But I do feel like that's a really small, you're going to buy one material or the other, and so if you have that spec in the code, it seems like a pretty easy thing, unless only, I could see pushback being maybe cost, but probably even more so familiarity with a product or availability of a product. I hesitate to think that these prices are probably wildly different, but I don't know. I can check into that for sure. I can get some of that information. And if you could pass along that spec from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that'd be helpful.
Yep.
And so I would just bring up what Director Sylvester said. Like if you, look through this section. You should have a pretty complete packet. My packet had a bunch of repeating pages though. So let me know if you need the full section. But look through it and think about how we've evaluated these standards over time and if things have been problematic or maybe just not protective enough, or if you feel like we could be doing more in a thoughtful way, but the code's just not written that way. And now really is the time to make those changes. Again, this is a commercial zoning overhaul, but because we open up the entire chapter, any amendments that we want to make can just kind of get put through that same process and approved by City Commission. Which, again, I think we'll be looking for that this summer based on, again, that feedback that we're getting from the public.
Just going to make one more comment to respond to your question about the tree replacement. We don't have to necessarily get into a full discussion right now, but I think that where the previous language failed in sort of practicality of fitting that many trees into this space, it had the spirit of, you're compromising by losing this 36-inch tree or this 24-inch tree or whatever. And our goal was to make sure whatever tree is planted there is going to be successful and the right species is chosen, rather than try to fit in a bunch of little trees that aren't going to make sense with the space. But I think what's lost in that change, now that I've had longer to think about, is that, if that's a 50-year-old or 100-year-old tree and you plant a whip or a sapling, they call them, that's, maybe a couple of years old, you've got, 80 years before you gain the caliber that tree had. And so there's sort of something lost in the process. And then it seems like it also just becomes a lot easier and cheaper to remove larger trees from the site. So just the idea that maybe with that same intent, there's a mechanism of where the site didn't have the room to replace with that many trees, maybe that intent could go into a different pooled fund or something like that, where it could be used in city parks, it could be used by neighborhood associations or community groups or things like that, that would sort of maybe infill elsewhere in the urban canopy, or just so that the intent still stays there, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because you had mentioned it at the beginning and we hadn't covered that yet. I'd like to talk to the city attorney. There is a case that I think was tried in the last 1 to 2 years, maybe just over a year ago. It was a case brought forward in Canton Township, I believe. It was a developer who had a similar ordinance to NFP, and they had a fund that an owner had to pay into for having removed some trees. I think cleared a significant number of trees. So the cost that they got billed was significant as well. I feel like it was 6 figures. And that got struck down. So their ordinance got struck down as not legal in Canton Township. And so it's been a precedent that, especially in planning circles, there's been a lot of talk about. Our city attorney has reviewed that case in NFP and feels like NFP is very, very site-specific and kind of properly addresses some of the concerns that brought down the ordinance in that township. And so City Attorney Robinson feels really good about the way the NFP is written now. I would like to compare, though, what issues came up with Canton Township and their fund for tree replacement off-site, and whether we might get into some concerns that would have some, would be legally questionable for an owner who maybe wanted to bring into question that part of the ordinance. So let me check on that and get Attorney Robinson maybe to weigh in for us on his recommendation for adding that back in, because it certainly was in our ordinance the first go-around, and it was again in August that got lifted. And I can't remember, I feel like Canton Township actually happened after it, so I don't feel like it was in response to that, but it's worth checking that out.
Yeah, that'd be great. And maybe it's not possible, just the idea that maybe the spirit of it could stay there, just be applied in a different way, but.
We do have the NFP board can approve alternative locations. This is for replacement trees. Can approve alternative locations if on-site replacement is not possible, provided that the alternative is within the city of Kalamazoo. But I guess that's, it's easier now to replace a tree because we changed that standard. So it's unlikely that people will need to find an off-site replacement as things are written now.
Yeah, and I think maybe, now that you just said that out loud, I think maybe the Canton issue was more of the fact of a fund that was set up versus the idea that if you own a car wash, like the case before us today, they have multiple car wash locations. Maybe they want to choose to plant it elsewhere on a property they own and then commit to maintain it. That seems like it would have applicant buy-in because they're suggesting that, and we're not asking them to pay into some fund where they don't know where their money goes. I will ask about that. You're right, that is still in there. Thanks for pointing that out, because I think that was that idea that we want to make sure that tree gets replanted in some way, and trying to provide an alternative if needed.
One I guess, perhaps comparable concept that could be used would be mitigation. There's all these wetland mitigation sites where the state wants to see the functionality of wetlands in the watershed maintained for all the different, purposes that they have. So if a developer needs to fill in wetland in a certain area and that's permitted, then there's sort of a scale of, well, then it needs to be replaced somewhere else within that watershed. So even though it's not in the exact same place, the function of what used to be there, at least in concept, and there's a lot of problems with it too, but at least the function stays within that unit. So maybe that's another way to think about it.
Coming back to the question you asked earlier as to when a tree of some substance is to be removed and to be replaced, and the concern that it would be replaced with a tree that may not even have a good chance of survival. The check on that, though, as I understand it, is our review then of the landscape plan, correct? And the enforcement then of the landscape plan. Is that not correct?
I think so. The assumption that that tree is going to survive and then fill that, compensate for that loss.
Yes.
I think that's what the city folks that make sure the site's, meeting its standards
Right.
would.
But for instance, in today's application, we will have a second look at the landscape plan that they develop, and that will be our next chance to visit that.
True.
Isn't that so?
Yeah.
I think I'm understanding that.
Yeah.
So,
I think as far as that individual tree getting placed in the,
Yes.
the right area or that, yeah.
yes,
makes
and
sense
to
for
be a
that.
tree of sufficient substance.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess the struggle is that like you can't buy time. So if you lose an
Yeah,
80
that
year,
is true.
80-year tree, you know, and I guess they don't know like what is a reasonable amount of time to ask city staff to check in on that landscaping plan to make sure, you know, 10 years, I'm sure there's not the resources that city staff are going to be going out and making sure that tree survived. So it's sort of a hopeful basic.
In real practice, that is a,
Yeah, it's more complaint-driven,
Yeah.
I
right?
know from experience, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's going to be complaint-driven, like the neighboring property, the fence that was put up as a screening, or maybe some trees had gotten taken down or failed. There has to be probably someone who's impacted enough to report it to the city, and then they'd look up the plan. It's going to be very complaint-driven, and I think you're right. The more time passes, the less likely that anything would be enforced in that time. And certainly there are immediate benefits that take decades to gain back.
What is that time period? Is it until the site plan or the construction is finished, essentially, that the landscaping standards would be sort of verified that they're being upheld? Or would it just totally depend on each case?
I mean, it's in perpetuity, so we have a zoning, but one zoning inspector for the entire city. But yeah, there's sites that we just, it's a small enough town that you get a sense that, hey, there are no shrubs along the front of their property anymore. And so then that'd be an inspection, and then they'd look back at the most recent site plan. I mean, with records today, we generally have a good sense. Properties maybe that were somehow developed 50 years ago, those might be more difficult to go back on with records changing over time. But
Yeah.
I think in recent history, there are examples of, it is often the landscape right along the frontage that tends to go away through, you know, snow plowing and
Yep.
traffic in the parking lot. Even trees, trees in parking lots, it's just, I think our inspectors just know those are subject to oftentimes not surviving, and then it'll be a notice that would be sent out that they need to replant those trees, and they're given a certain amount of time, or then it would be, they would be subject to penalty under the zoning code.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Anything else on this conversation in this item? Otherwise, we can finish up the agenda.
All right. Looks like hearing no more conversation on item G, move on to item H, old business. I don't see anything listed here, Jamie, unless you have anything.
No old business at this time.
Okay, and then item I would be staff updates.
I have two staff updates. One has to do with maybe the same idea of how site plans are maintained and enforced over time. We had a project that came through the NFP review board. It's on Stadium Drive. It is actually immediately adjacent to the car wash that we heard about today, which had the incredibly tall, I want to say 20-foot retaining wall that was built in the back of the property. The retaining wall was fully engineered by a licensed engineer, had maybe some underlying stormwater issues that were not anticipated, and there was a pretty dramatic, a decent failure out there of the wall that's crumbling there. So they're, working with city staff and getting that repaired. I think it's critical enough of a failure that they have to address it, because that's where their parking was perched up on that 20-foot retaining wall. I only bring it up to this group because I know the engineering team that came forward and presented the plans felt like this was a good alternative, and it saved some of the woodland and slope in the back, and I know it had to get a special variance to make that happen. So I just am throwing that out there as sort of this accounting and this experience that you all have as a board over time. I know the building official had said, man, that seems like a far more stable configuration if they would step it down into 2 10-foot tall retaining walls, or maybe even 3 smaller retaining walls. But it would have meant a little more variance for that woodland. It wasn't even woodland removal, but it was slope. So just something to keep in mind. They are working on that. I don't know At this time, I don't know that they have any plan to maybe change up that configuration. That would have to come back before the board if they were going to impact any more natural features, but just something to be aware of. I thought it was an interesting example to keep in mind, and I couldn't help but remember Director McNellis really like pulling up the picture, being very proud of this retaining wall, so it's very sad to see it does not look that pretty anymore. The other update, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that annual meeting time is coming up this spring, or this summer, I believe, for within the bylaws of this board. But the really important thing here is that it is an opportunity to choose new officers for chair and vice chair. I don't think there's anything in the bylaws that prevents you all from just electing the same individuals to move forward. However, Chair McNellis is no longer on the board, and he was the vice chair. So if you guys can be thinking about who might serve well in those positions, I haven't had a conversation with Chair Colwick yet, but I'll do that to see what she's thinking about as far as continuing to serve as chair, or if she wants to rotate out of that position.
What officers do we have?
Per the bylaws, there are only 2 officers. It's the chair and the vice chair, and they do not have to meet as a separate committee, but they do take on the responsibility of chairing meetings for us. So I'll send out some formal details on when we should organize that annual meeting, and then you all can have a discussion about officer positions.
Great. Okay, any announcements? I'm just going to make a really quick announcement. We have a small neighborhood group in the Vine neighborhood, and as of this spring, I think 2021 was when we started, we've planted 100 trees in the Vine neighborhood using the right-of-way curb lawn area specifically, working with Brian LaBelle and looking at the curb lawn ordinance, making sure the spacing and everything is correct. But Building Blocks has been a big supporter of ours, and lots of neighborhood residents have come out to help and things like that, doing that canopy infill and using some of those native species that are in our NFP list. So just kind of proud of that. But
What size and what variety of trees are you planting?
there's probably like 18 or 20 different kinds that we've used. So if they're under the high tension lines, we use small trees like redbud and alternate leaf dogwood, crab apples, things like that. And then otherwise there's anything from Kentucky coffee tree, tulip trees, oak trees. And the inventory that the city did was really helpful in sort of laying out diversity issues with the urban tree canopy, a lot of Norway maple, a lot of Bradford pear and things like that. So not a ton of oaks, and so we emphasize those a lot, but have a good variety. So if some bug comes through that really likes to munch on maple trees, that we don't lose our whole canopy.
Dr. Leto, if I could just, I know this is board announcement times, but that does feel like a lot of the NFP Phase 3 work that the city has kind of started to or tried to launch a couple of different times. The sort of path that we first charted out with the public when we first undertook NFP was that we would have NFP 1, which was the first phase, which was create a map and create some standards and make it this regulatory ordinance-driven process. And then phase 2 was we're going to make a better map and better standards, and I think we really fulfilled that. But phase 3 was always that there's, you can't regulate everything everywhere, and so we needed to have this sort of voluntary education type base. But I think some of the work that you've been doing in Vine, I would love to talk a little bit more about. Maybe even it's just advertising that to other neighborhoods and giving them ideas of what's possible. And it sounds like you've just had this very informed process and really thoughtful process to pick trees and pick locations. So anyway, that really feels like a lot of NFP Phase 3 kind of commitments that we had talked about doing within the city. So we should catch up at some point.
Yeah, that's great. And Edison neighborhood it's kind of spilled over, and some of our volunteers and residents have gone to Edison to help that. But in a different way that kind of makes sense neighborhood by neighborhood. So it's been fun. But okay, any other announcements? All right, then we will adjourn the meeting.